Should be recording now. All right. So thank you everyone for coming to our presentation today. I wanted to open by acknowledging the murder of George Floyd by a police officer in Minneapolis and the pain and struggle of Black Americans to have their right to life be recognized in this country. And this struggle is carried out by several of the community organizations we will highlight here today, and we are dedicated as a research team here to serving as allies and working for their causes. So in the interest of time, Bono, can you go to the next slide? I'm just going to do a quick introduction of the team. So we have our principal investigators, Dean Bill Marr and Professor Roger Crooks, who are here on the call. And we have our wonderful manager, Jenny Fan, who has been so great. I'm Lucy Pye. I'm a grad student in informatics, and Bono Agato is the other grad student who is running this NSF-REU with me. And our undergraduate students who have been so wonderful throughout this whole program. We have Sion Ovikian, Edgar Partida, who isn't here with us this quarter, but worked with us the first 2 quarters, Suti Rana, Manasi Singane, and Kevin Vasquez. And so before we move on, I'm just gonna give you a quick highlight of how the whole presentation is gonna run. So first, Bono is gonna give us a brief highlight of the design of the RU program and the roots of this project. And then the undergraduate students are gonna share their research deliverables, their findings and reflections on the program. And then after that, we're gonna give some time for Bill and Roderick to share their responses and ask the team questions. And then finally, we're gonna open it up to a Q&A with the whole audience. So Bono, take it away.
So thanks, Lucy. Last March at UT Austin, on behalf of the team, I presented at the Informatics Education Conference, where I shared how this particular REU program was designed to develop a multidisciplinary research experience for undergraduates. Today, I will share an abridged version of that presentation to provide us an overview of the program's history, design, and accomplishments. The objective being to reflect on our experiences in running an REU as graduate students, and to also encourage faculty and fellow graduate students to develop such programs. So it all started back in winter quarter of 2019 when Professor Crooks and I co-organized the Datafication and Community Activism workshop, duly supported by Dean Marius of ICS. Motivated by the work of community-based organizations such as Data for Black Lives and Measure Austin, we proposed that the consequences of datafication demand new approaches to research and collective action. We gathered community organizers, activists, and academics for a 2-day workshop where we primarily listened to voices frequently marginalized by our academic institutions to figure out the relationship between knowledge and action and to think together about the state of community-based research. We committed to respond to a challenge laid down by Yeshi Milner, that is, to make bold demands to institutions and to hold ourselves accountable for a better collective future. Details regarding the workshop can be found online by searching what we mean when we say #AbolishBigData 2019. Dean Bill was one of our participants. Curious as to where the workshop can lead us, Dean Bill approached Dr. Crooks with an idea of running an REU along the lines of the workshop's ideals and objectives. The Research Experience for Undergraduates program supports active research participation by undergraduate students in any of the areas of research funded by the National Science Foundation. At the core of the REU is NSF's articulated belief that undergraduate research is in itself the purest form of both faculty teaching and student learning. NSF released a report back in 2017 that looks at undergraduate research experiences for STEM students, surveying successes, challenges, and opportunities. Both Lucy and I highly recommend this report to folks who are considering coming up with and or assessing their undergraduate research programs. The evaluations and recommendations in the report served as the foundation of the overall design of our REU. Our research agenda is as follows. Within the broader scope concerning the intersections of technology and law, this research project seeks to understand how organizations that serve minoritized communities use data to argue for or against particular policies of the state. We study how data is conceptualized and utilized by community organizations advocating across different intersecting data justice domains. We analyze both rhetorics and practices that surround data within community organizations throughout their data practices. Ultimately, we aim to uncover assumptions that are built into data infrastructures and engagements and how they shape the relationships between community orgs, the communities they serve, and the state government they engage with. We envision our research to have implications towards minoritized communities' fight against data-fied oppression and their pursuit for data justice. So this program began in fall of 2019 and it officially wraps up today, end of spring instruction 2020. Fall quarter was designed to equip students with research skills necessary to undertake the research project. We led the students to explore and own the research agenda that by the end of the quarter, students were able to answer the question, what do we know about the intersections of data justice, community orgs, and the law, while developing research questions and methods to address identified gaps. Winter quarter was the research proper, quote unquote, where students test and polish their questions, methods, and tools, and eventually set out to gather data in the field. They engage community organizers as to answer the question, what do community organizations say about their relationship with data and how do they articulate them? Spring quarter is when they bring everything together as they work on and share program deliverables, including a database, their research notes and materials, and a series of scholarly publication and events. In addition, they begin to analyze and reflect on their experiences as to identify how they inform our understanding of ethics and computing. So we expanded this explore, engage, share framework in identifying and pursuing the learning objectives of the program, which is laid out on this slide. The highlighted quotes were lifted from the students' regular blog posts or interviews and were often heard during lab meetings and discussions. Here we map them with the learning objectives. I wish to highlight one of them. We aim to develop the student skills in multidisciplinary research, which included jumping and bridging between computing skills with social science research methods. You can imagine the initial confusion when the group of mostly computer science students started talking about coding, in terms of coding a database on one hand and coding interviews on the other. That said, the students eventually saw the relationship between the two, with one of them reflecting on the juice of property, limitations, and violence of coding in both cases. It was always satisfying to see the students bridge disciplines and methods together, a series of aha moments of utter delight. The undergraduate students committed up to 50 hours of work per quarter, but honestly, it went beyond that, and were duly compensated accordingly at $15 per hour, with a surprise bonus raised by the spring quarter. Thanks, Dean Bill and Jenny. Actual contact hours with graduate students were between 1.5 to 3 hours per week, with the principal investigators regularly joining sessions once a month. The PIs set this research agenda and were in close coordination with the graduate students who ran the program, in addition to the generous support and guidance of Jenny Fan. Throughout the year-long program, the students worked on interrelated deliverables that build on each other. While these deliverables were set by the PIs, the specifics of which were developed by the students to give them ownership and a sense of responsibility towards them. We, of course, changed specifics as the research moved along, changes that were based on leads and or sheer practicalities. These deliverables and activities, duly quantified, are summarized on this slide. So you can see that the students read and annotated literature, collected case studies, which eventually were developed into a database. They interviewed community organizations. They worked on a scholarly output. They are co-authoring one journal article with the team. And all the while actively reflecting on their output experiences through blog posts, essays, and interviews. They will talk about these in the report that follows. But for now, I'm going to hand it over to Lucy for our reflections as graduate students.
So I'm going to keep it brief, but it's been a really valuable experience for Bono and I to lead this REU. We've had a lot of growth mentoring, figuring out how to set up a curriculum and respond to feedback and like changing situations on the ground in terms of what students are able to do or what constraints are met with trying to interview community organizations and everything like that. But I just want to give the most amount of time to students to share their results with us. So Manasi, do you want to share your screen?
Yeah.
Cool, take it away.
Okay, so hi everyone. This is our presentation of findings, experiences, and reflections of undergraduate researchers as part of the NSF-REU on community organizations, data justice, and law. My name is Monesi.
I'm Kevin.
Judy.
I'm Sia.
Yeah, we'll get started. So our presentation is going to be structured in this way. So we're going to start off by providing a brief overview of the program starting from fall quarter. Then we're going to talk about one of our deliverables, the case studies, and we'll also discuss another deliverable, which is the database. And then we're going to move on to our findings from the interviews and with the community organization. Then we'll discuss the publication, and then we'll conclude by providing individual reflections about the REU. So Sion will go ahead and talk about the overview from fall and winter quarter now.
So during fall, we started with one main question of how do organizations that serve minoritized communities use data to interact with state policy? This question was then broken down into what community organizations use data in their advocacies, how do these community organizations perceive or define data, how do these community orgs mobilize data in their advocacies, what have been the results in terms of laws and government policies or projects, if any, of the utilization of data by these community orgs. Since we did not start with concrete instructions, the team had full freedom to explore almost any source with potential, making the research experience much richer. On the quest of finding answers to these questions as a team, we profiled more than 20 community orgs in detail and went through a number of related publications. Although we found some answers to the provided questions, our main findings were more questions, like what is considered a community org? Or what is data justice? What is the life cycle of data? Is there an ecosystem of data, or how widespread is recycling data? We also came across possible trends, like all of which were presented in the fall presentation a few months ago, which we'll summarize here as well. During winter, we had more leads and information to work with. One of our main objectives for winter was to produce a database for all the orgs we had profiled. We also had the chance to set up an interview protocol where we not only interviewed each other as undergrads, but also interviewed selected community orgs. Finally, we started working on a scholarly publication focused mainly on ethical education in computer science. Later in spring, we finished the development of the database and spent most of our time writing the publication focused on ethics in computer science. And we can now talk more about how we started with the case studies during fall. So we started by going through more than 60 community organizations that were using data in one way or another. And from there, we developed 21 of them into detailed case studies, all of which were placed under one or more domains of criminal justice, environment, health, education, and housing. From there, and as a result of putting all these orgs next to each other, we interestingly noticed an overlap in how these organizations use data. Seemingly, all of these orgs were profiled, all the orgs we profiled were using data to either impact policy, provide some type of service, or produce some type of publication. And we will now expand on the database we produced out of the case studies.
So first, we wanted to ensure that our case studies would be easily accessible, viewable, comparable, and searchable. So we examined the pros and cons of multiple options we could have used to create a database, such as Excel, MySQL, SQL, and Django. Our first effort to make a database based on our case studies was based in Excel, along Pandas, a Python software library to help with data extraction. And we chose Excel initially because it is commonly available, and we wanted the database to be easily updated and maintained by future researchers. And in the Excel database, we included fields such as policy, publishing, and service to show how community organizations conceptualize and use data. And we also recorded where organizations obtained public data from, if any. However, the Excel format was most compatible to a more binary and quantitative storage of information. So in order to preserve the rich text-based data that we collected, we ultimately decided to use FileMaker Pro as our database software, Edgar, an undergraduate researcher who worked on this project in the past quarters, and I built a simple database that will be easy to use by future researchers if necessary. And then finally, we also created data dictionaries for both databases to be used as reference to clarify the fields used in the databases. And now we'll demonstrate some of the features and functionalities of the database. Okay, so as you can see from Bono's shared screen, we divided each case study into 3 sections. The top one being the profile of the community organization, and the bottom 2 being policy and data. So you can also search for by keywords in each of the fields. So for example, we could filter a specific particular data justice domain, such as environment, and this will yield results based on the filter. Yeah, and yeah. Honestly, could you also share your screen now too? Okay, then can you go to the next slide, please? Thanks. Okay, so so what we found based on the case studies and database was that data usage varies based on size and domain of organizations, and community organizations often attempt to fit data into their narrative. As Sian discussed, most organizations we examined had an agenda, and to back their actions and goals within their agenda, they use data visualizations. Also, categorizations were helpful in the Excel sheet, but at the same time, we felt that the fields were also limiting and constraining as opposed to the format of the FileMaker Pro database. And now we will discuss our interview findings with community organizers.
So while the case studies were helpful in order for us to get an intuition for the purpose and the work of organizations, we wanted to learn more about how the organizations worked past their website and internet presence. So our next focus was to interview certain organizations so we could get a better understanding of their work and the role that data plays within their work. So our process involved developing a question protocol, getting the IRB certification, contacting organizations, and then getting consent from the people that we were interviewing. In order to develop our question protocol, we sat down with Professor Crooks and discussed some of the important things to consider when we interview people. This included having a semi-structured format based on the flow, that allowed us to be able to build off our interviews responses. And this was helpful because it allowed us to ask questions based on the flow of the interview rather than something super set in stone. Professor Crooks also gave us some tips on how to ask questions respectfully and concerns we might face when interviewing other people. Next, we made sure to obtain our IRB certification, and then we contacted organizations who we wanted to learn more about. So this turned out to be a little bit of a struggle since a lot of the organizations hadn't updated their contact information online, and we were specifically trying to find people in data-related roles within these organizations because of trends that we saw in the case studies relating to data. So it took many attempts at contacting different organizations to get our interview set up, and but eventually we got around to doing it. And then finally, we made sure to get consent from our interviewees, such that we could use their interview in our work and properly give them credit in our work if they desired that. So while protecting the anonymity of participants is the default, we also considered that interviewees might want to be given credit for their interviews or invited to be co-authors on a paper based on their conversation with us. So now Studi will talk about her experience interviewing her organization. And for the purposes of interviewee confidentiality, community organizations and interviewees are going to remain anonymous in the following slides.
So my interview was with a member of an environmental organization. For some context, the organization had been around for over 40 years and has the aim to protect public health and prevent climate change. Their work revolves heavily around policy advocacy, lobbying, and drafting legislation. They specifically work to eliminate vehicle emissions and port emissions in Southern California, since those are a big part of the pollution in LA County's area. The organization doesn't research directly. Instead, through a network of organizations in Southern California, they're given reports and they use a lot of state reports for their advocacy. So the job of repackaging, analyzing, and concisely summarizing this data to advocate and inform falls in the hands of my interviewee. Their main job, my interviewees, was to inform state legislatures of bills in progress or problems that are happening in their area. So when I reached out to the organization to ask to interview their data scientists, I was redirected to my interviewee, who was actually able to be in charge of the policy advocacy in the organization. So when I asked my interviewee who worked as a who in the organization worked as a data scientist or was a data person, they said that there was no such person. But when I rephrased the question to be, who's the set person that looks at data and reports and repackages them? And they answered that they were that person. However, with an emphasis that their job was not technical in nature at all. They said, I'm not a data scientist. I don't collect data personally. I bumble around in Excel. But for me, it's more so about what the data means for people and for the mission commitments and what's the best way to get there. So an interesting takeaway I had with my interviewee was the fact that there was a discrepancy between my interviewee's perceived and actual role. Though they may not be a computer scientist or mathematician, their work with data still made them a data scientist of sort, because what is data work other than analyzing, repackaging, and presenting data in a changed format? So it provides a curious dilemma of, if those that work in data and community organizations don't perceive their roles as such, what effect that has on the data and on their presentation of it. And now we'll talk about our second community organization.
So my interview was with a member of a community organization that documents and populates city records of police misconduct to the community in an accessible tool for the public in order to hold police officers accountable for their actions. Otherwise, without these tools, these records would be difficult for the public to access, as they would be in obscure internal databases. The data work of the organization involves processing and understanding the internal inconsistencies of the data sets that they receive. They will investigate, process, unify the data with other data sets, and do cross-referencing. They also put effort into obtaining public record requests, which are often very hard to obtain from the government. So this is also a lengthy process. Also, interestingly, the organization works with a UX designer and performs tasks such as interviewing users to make sure their products and data analyses are reflecting the real felt needs of their users and stakeholders. This organization defines good data as data that's responsible. And what that means is that the data obtained by the organization is supposed to have redacted confidential information. And if these police departments fail to redact this information by mistake, they have confidential information, which then creates issues. So one of the most insightful answers that I received was after I asked if the interviewee believed there are any limits to what we can use, do, or learn from data. And the interviewee then explained that an important component of the work involves understanding real-world events that had to occur for the data to be generated, such as finding out how the data was generated, where the data came from, who was responsible for creating it, who did the intake, who did the form, and what kind of pressures was that person feeling when they filled out the form, and how did that data flow from that individual moment to the current moment. Understanding the real world component of data is an important part in mitigating what the interviewee calls it data hubris. So data hubris is being overconfident that you know everything just because you have a lot of data. It's very easy to mistake that. It's very easy to make that mistake because data can give you the sense, the feeling that you know everything. The patterns that come out of data can appear very insightful and powerful. So the organization is concerned with what kinds of mistakes they can make when misinterpreting data. So to solve data hubris, according to the interviewee, it is very important to work with peers who are very skeptical and critical and ask good questions regarding the data. Also, it is important to perform thorough investigation and on-the-ground experience-based learning about how the data originates. The interview stated that the biggest limitation of one understanding data is making assumptions. Understanding how the data was generated will give someone the knowledge needed in order to make realistic and meaningful derivations from the data. So overall, they believe that data itself is not enough. Data must be critiqued and analyzed in regard to its life cycle. And according to the interviewee, The important skills necessary to be successful in data science related work are being curious, persistent, and never accepting assumptions as truth. Instead, one must continuously investigate and look deeper into data to catch mistakes before others do. Okay, and now Sian will discuss his interview.
We'll move on to the next slide.
Oh.
Yeah, thank you. So my interviewee was the former project manager and evangelist at this organization, which I worked at a few summers ago and has closed down recently. This was a community org aiming to provide access to people with non-traditional backgrounds to get into tech. It was acquired by a larger parent organization because the parent organization was aiming to end the cycle of poverty by leveraging education for the youth. The original smaller organization, however, focused on providing services for adults and people with non-traditional backgrounds. According to the interviewee, at one point, their parent organization had about $52 million in funding, making them one of the larger orgs in LA. When I asked the interviewee about the main use of data at the parent org, they said, data proved everything. Data proved our funding. Data that our analysts were using proved things we were doing in LA were impactful. It also proved how much money we need to provide to the organization in order for it to run. This was an interesting finding because in the fall quarter, we had noticed community orgs using data to justify their existence, and this seemed to be another instance of that. I then asked them about their general thoughts about data usage by community orgs, and their answer was, I wish more people leverage data. I wish a lot more nonprofits used GIS data from local neighborhoods. Again, data is king. One aspect that made this organization interesting was the fact that it had closed down. In a follow-up, I asked the interviewee what happened to all the data the parent organization stored, to which their response was, it's sitting on a computer somewhere that's locked up in the Beverly office. And as for the child organization's data, they stopped paying for the CRM and pretty sure it's in a server somewhere for G-stars. This ties directly into one of our questions from fall, where we wanted to find out more about the life cycle of data. And it turned out in this specific case, the data used by the organization was never destroyed and possibly still exists to this day. And personally, my main takeaway from this interview was how much they valued the use of data. They even went on to say data is king twice. And we can move on to the next organization now.
So I picked this specific quote of, this community organization bringing their resources back to the community, because I think it touches on a lot of important findings from my interview. My interviewee had been working at this organization for about 2 years. And what was particularly interesting was that they made it a point to differentiate their role as a community organizer rather than an activist. They described community organizing as community-based work rather than activism, which they described as advocacy through social media, such as posting petitions or showing up to a protest. Community organizers, on the other hand, work towards small changes based on the ground over time, based on the needs and the wants of the community. So following this, the interviewee emphasized the importance of bringing data back to the community. They would utilize data for infographics and reports which they then used to support legislation that they would participate in writing. So for example, one of the infographics that they developed was a map of LA County that mapped the uses of police brutality in each county. Their reports would cover a specific topic such as police brutality or gang violence in the area. And the data, which was also interesting, was often collected by the community itself. The interviewee detailed the collection of data related to a bill that they had passed previously concerning police brutality. And they described that the community had been collecting this data for a long time, that they had kept a list of all of the police officers who had killed someone in their area. And through their use of resources as a larger community organization, combined with this collected data from the community, they were able to combine infographics and support to get this legislation passed. And other dissemination of data included adding leaflets to bike spokes or projecting infographics onto police walls. Another way that they obtained data was through reading police reports, similar to the organization that Kevin mentioned. This was also a challenge for them because it was unfortunate because they advocated for accessibility to these reports, but once this victory was made, they weren't prioritized in receiving these documents. The reports were very expensive, and other people from other organizations with more funding or more publicity, such as journalists from news companies,
Let's give Monse a second to reconnect.
You guys, this is great. I'm shook. This is amazing.
This is really great. This is like making my week, actually.
Me too.
Thanks, everyone. See if
Poor Monse.
Let's give Monis a few minutes. Otherwise, I can share the slide and then someone from the group can read the rest of the script if people have access to it. Yeah, let's give us just 13 more seconds.
Is somebody texting her to see if she can rejoin or if everything's okay?
Yeah, I'm trying.
Okay, thanks, Kevin.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'm sharing the screen now. In the interest of time, Stuti, do you mind reading the rest of the Monasi's stuff?
Yeah.
Thanks.
So, so from what I recall, basically the issues of reading the reports that the organization had established was very emotionally traumatizing, and reading reports related to part of the community itself. And of course, as you know, that it's difficult to read the last moment of someone's life, especially because that organization worked directly with the community and was so heavily impacted. And so finally, we're interested in the relationship between the community orgs and academia. And they described like a lack of trust between the organization and academia, mostly due to the fact that many professors don't give the respect that the community organizers rightly deserve, simply due to the fact they don't have a formal degree. So, which was very duly expressed by the interviewee that Monasi did. Moreover, they had instances in which people, even academics, don't give proper credit to the org's work, like in their workshops or campaigns. And this has been because others considered the org to be too radical or not professional enough. So credit was completely not given. Other times, academics will say that the work with the org, even though they only came for they worked with the org even though they only came for one meeting and never really had any follow through or didn't actually do any outputs with them. So now we are going to discuss some trends that in the orgs that we had interviewed. So based on all our interviews, the data conceptualization and we realized data conceptualization and its use within community organizations was provisional and contingent. And this may give rise to any trends in specific domains, but throughout, because we did such varying domain interviews, that there was no specific trend overlapping all of the domains.
Okay, so just a quick update. I think she said her computer crashed, but it's up now, so she's trying to connect. So should be back.
So
I don't know if we just want to give her like 30 seconds maybe, because.
No, she's here.
Oh, she's here. Okay. Awesome.
I mean, she's logging in.
computer like crashed.
Yeah, Monasi, I'm sharing my screen, so feel free to proceed.
Okay.
We're
Finish
on
this slide.
slide 18.
So yeah, we can all agree based on our interviews and our findings that data conceptualization and use is provisional, situational, and contingent. This might give rise to any trend specific to domain. So given these findings from our interview, it became clear that having some knowledge in ethics was vital in order to incite real change, even within the technological space. So our publication, in which all of us are co-authors, concerned the use of ethics in computer science curricula and our experience learning ethics through a research experience for undergraduate students. Yeah. So in order to do this, we went through current computer science curricula to see if they were requiring ethics-related classes. And we also went through current programs geared towards increasing the importance of ethics in CS curricula and also previous papers written on RU experiences. So within the paper, we discuss interviews we conducted amongst each other as a method of self-reflection. And we use this to reflect on how our perspectives on ethics and computer science have changed over the course of the REU. So finally, we conclude by giving some recommendations based on this experience, which Studi will now discuss.
So our first recommendation is that teaching ethics and computing is an interdisciplinary task. We found that reading across multiple disciplines can actually illuminate unquestioned assumptions that we ourselves might constrain that we hold, and then we can understand about ethics and computing to be. It's not just about taking bias out of data or programming algorithms that are more fair. The very purpose of computing technology must be questioned, and as well as the social structures from which it is produced into which it's released. So our next recommendation is that teaching ethics and computing must be grounded in community engagement. Our ethics are situated with and for communities who are most vulnerable in the face of computing systems and practices. To teach ethics then entails that we seek, hear, and respond to these communities that are greatly impacted but are barely included in computing decisions that shape their lives. A fundamental implication of this is to see our CS curricula not as a pipeline to the tech industry, but rather as a service to our communities. Our last recommendation is that teaching ethics is an ongoing process with others. Becoming ethical is not a one-time accomplishment that we can gain through exposure to right ideas or experiences with the right activity. There's no set content that can apply across all situations. Ultimately, there is no right way to carry out a project or address a situation. Our experience in the REU showed us that having reflexive and self-critical discussions with our peers helped us build this practice of confronting new dilemmas in computing and navigating our own position as computer scientists. So by incorporating aspects of multidisciplinary collaboration, community engagement, and formal mechanisms for practicing reflexivity, we can create a more seamless avenue for integrating ethics into CS education. So given these findings, here are our personal reflections on the REU.
Okay, so as much as we researched case studies in the fall, there was only so much that we could learn by learn regarding these community organizations without actually speaking to members of those organizations. And by doing so, I learned answers to many intriguing questions that I had about the organization, such as like a detailed description of a daily work day for that member, how members of that organization view different aspects of data, such as what good data is, and how that organization interacts with data and uses data to pursue their notions of justice. Also, involving people in our work helped us to see a personal account of that organization and gave us an in-depth look at its operations. Because there was a lot of personal aspects of community organization that cannot be learned through a website. Like for example, I learned that for the organization that I interviewed, they heavily work with a UX designer in order to have the outputs of the organization match the real needs of their users and stakeholders by constantly performing interviews with said users. And these are things that I would have never figured out on my own, even with countless hours of research, because I would not be researching the core of the organization, which is the members. And I learned that the principles of involving the community and your audience and user base applies to all work and research that involves other people. And by doing so, you can avoid biases and making assumptions about a topic or community and obtain a deeper understanding of those you are seeking to understand. Overall, these ideas tie in with the multidisciplinary nature of our RU and serve as a great example of a first-hand account of its positive effects in research. And now Studi will talk about her interview experiences.
So similarly to Kevin, when reflecting in my interview over my undergraduate career to this point, I realized that though I have a wide range of experiences in the technical domains of CS, I had little to no knowledge about the failures that come from the computing systems. Throughout the REU, I became more knowledgeable about the issues of black box computer systems that are meant to hold people accountable, especially in social injustice systems, but they themselves have no accountability. This really emphasized the lack of attention paid to the integration of users into computer systems. The closest experience I have had with this is in Informatics 43, where we were taught different methods to involve users in the design of computer interfaces. However, such examples of the importance of communities usually became lost in the technical details of our courses. And so we can now move on to Manasi's reflection.
So I think many times in a lot of the papers or the books that we read, we learn about some code or predictive algorithm that didn't account for bias, and it resulted in discriminatory behavior. And I think a lot of computer scientists, we know about this issue. We see this a lot in the news of facial recognition not recognizing certain people, or certain people of color are disproportionately profiled. But something that we really need to remember is that a lot of these problems have solutions. We just have to be better about implementing them. So one of the papers that I read this past quarter by Stephanie Glaverson, it was on predictive algorithms and how to fix biases within predictive algorithms, but I think their solutions can be applied in other areas as well. So one of these was using open source code when developing code related to society, or making predictive algorithms impacting society. So this this is helpful because it makes sure that our code is absolutely transparent, and we are very open about the way that people are using data. And it's helpful because other people might not be able to only point out the flaws in our code, but they're also able to make it better. We know that open source code works, and we've seen it really help many companies flourish and thrive. And the thing about tech is that it's really easy to get a group of a couple people and code up something that's really great, but the nature of this lacks diversity. And by making it open source, you could invite people from all sorts of different backgrounds to point out areas of bias that you might not be able to realize yourself. So it's also important to work with policymakers to ensure that there's definitive legislation regarding codes like predictive algorithms. By placing limits on the code, it ensures that the result of the algorithm is not considered to be the ultimate truth, and rather it's a combination of code and human discretion that's ultimately used. So now Sion will talk about his experience.
Yeah, so the interview among undergrads was interesting to me because it was focused on our own experiences. I had the chance to reflect on my time here at UCI and the quality of education I received. We also brought up questions surrounding ethics and why the computer science degree does not really require any ethics courses, and seemingly does not even offer any. The only course we found related to ethics was a graduate course about the ethics of AI. Based on the interviews, we all generally agreed that ethics has never been a point of focus in any of our courses, especially in our upper division courses. This then raises questions like, as CS students, do we have enough or any exposure to the ethical concepts that apply to our work, or do we spend enough time in a classroom setting discussing the importance of systems we are learning to build? I also found great value in going through all the publications throughout fall and winter. It is not very common to have reading assignments in upper division CS courses, aside from the technical textbooks. So the publications I was exposed to during this REU were an interesting addition to my time at UCI. And to wrap up the presentation, we started this fall with a few high-level questions, which then turned into even more questions, resulting in producing a database of community orgs, a detailed interview protocol with 4 in-depth interviews, and a scholarly publication draft that will be submitted in a few weeks. And with that, I wanted to thank all the community organizers we researched and worked with who made this research possible: National Science Foundation, School of Social Sciences, ICS, our PIs, Dr. Bill Murray and Dr. Roger Crooks, Jenny Fan, of course, Mona and Lucy, and Edgar, who couldn't be with us during spring, Dr. Rebecca Black and Dr. Bill Tomlinson, who were letting us use the green IT room, and of course, anyone else who helped with the project. And thank you all for taking the time to be here.
I don't know how to like clap for people on Zoom, but yeah, you can mime our clapping. Thank you all so much for such a great presentation. What's next on our schedule is to have Professor Crooks and Professor Marr give their responses, comments, and questions to the students before we open it up for a general Q&A.
Dean Marr, do you want to go first, or do you want me to go first?
Oh, you can go. Go ahead, Roderick.
Okay. Well, thanks everybody for coming. I'm actually really moved. I find it like difficult to sort of come up with an intelligent question. I took some notes, but I guess the first thing I just want to say was I'm so moved by the work that you did, and I really appreciate it. At the beginning, when we like started the project, I think I struggled because I was asking you to deal with ambiguity, and I think a lot of that's very difficult for students. I think particularly undergraduates. So I feel like you kind of embraced that messiness and did a lot of cool stuff with it. So I'm so appreciative. And then I guess the other thing I really appreciate is that you kept the community organizations that you worked with and the community organizers that were kind enough to participate in our project. You kept them present in your work. And so like when you were sharing what you talked with them about, I felt like they were a little bit with us today. And that's really hard to do. And also I think that's super important. So I definitely want to thank you for that. So I guess, could we maybe go back to the questions that we started with? So this is for our research associates. So we started with big questions, kind of situated within the realm of data for good, or data direct. Let's say data for good means data directed to community defined purposes, environmental justice, ending or redressing police violence. So we saw a variety of approaches and a variety of responses from community organizations with respect to the potential for data good. So we heard a view from community organization number one, that data can be meaningful, that data can make things happen in the world. On the other hand, we heard from, we also heard from community org number three, data is king. So data has some sort of power or some sort of authority to do something. Okay, we heard an opposite view though, right? We heard something to the contrary from community organization number two, was talking about data hubris, that idea that Kevin was telling us about. So to our research associates, when you look across cases, what have you learned about when data can contribute to social justice? And what would your advice be for researchers like myself, like Bono and like Lucy, who want to continue to study this idea about data justice?
Can you repeat the last like two sentences of your question?
Sure, it was a long question.
Yeah.
So given this kind of different view of community organizers and community organizations with respect to the potential for data to do good or data to be applied to social justice, in your opinion, thinking across the whole year you've been working in all the cases, what are the relevant things that researchers should think about when we're studying data justice? What are the things that go into making data just or not just? Or let's say effective for data justice or useful for data justice and then not useful for data justice.
Well, I don't know if in particular, like when you're reading my quote about data hubris, they weren't so much saying that the data wasn't good. They were saying that the data was really effective. It's just oftentimes it's very hard to obtain from these government officials because it's like a lengthy process. They'll try to stall. Oftentimes they just don't want to expose their police departments. And the quote about data hubris was more about how to effectively analyze data in general. It's not saying that data is bad. It's saying that when you're like analyzing data, you just have to be aware that if you make assumptions about the data without like doing on the ground research, or you're actually talking with these communities, or you're having people to kind of critique your own data and ask questions about it, you lead to assumptions, and these assumptions kind of lead to like unrealistic expectations and conclusions derived from your data. So my community organization personally thought it was, they didn't think that data was, I guess, not effective or bad in any way. It's just that they were pointing out certain like topics that you have to be aware of, like when processing and using data to like pursue your own like notions of data justice. So I don't know if anyone else wants to talk more about that.
Yeah, kind of. Oh, sorry, Stevie.
Environmental towards at least. I realized that from the interview that I had, a lot of the data is actually already there. And it, again, is very domain specific, but it's more so, as my interview you mentioned, that you have to like go out, see what the data means and what it can be used for. And he was very specific about like the data is present, but we have to repackage and inform constituents and legislators because some of them are just unaware, and using the data and just presenting it in a repackaged way is like a form of informing and therefore like justice, because you are informing them about their communities. But again, it's very domain specific. So I feel like Manasi and Kevin had different experiences because of the fact that their domains were very based on the social aspect and collecting data directly from and about communities, where ours was about data that was present about the environment the communities lived in, which is separate from the actual people themselves.
Kind of building off of Kevin's response about being like critical of the data, my org was also very similar in that, in two ways of like really understanding where the data comes from. In one way, because like, for example, one thing that my community org mentioned was just running the numbers by themselves, like how many cases of police brutality are there? It wasn't representative because some of the reports were incorrect in that they would have instances where police would falsify the coroner's reports and like coerce coroners into saying that if there was something in the victim's system, then instead of police brutality, the cause of death would be whatever was in their system instead. So that's why just really understanding where you're getting the data and what could be possible problems with the data you're getting, so you could account for that, is one way that it's important to be critical of the data. And then the other way is understanding like where the data comes from in terms of community. So like I mentioned, the community kind of built up this data set of their own. And because of that, so much analysis has been done. So understanding that like sometimes the data you're using comes from the community. So it's really important to take your analysis and give it back to the community as well. Because a lot of times like they know that they're facing these issues, but they still need to prove it to other people and for legislation. So by giving your analysis back to the community, you're like also thanking them for allowing you to use their data that they've compiled as well.
Also, I'm not sure if this would answer the question directly, but one problem the person I interviewed had was that the people higher up in the organization didn't know how to properly use data and technology in general. So they kept mentioning that the people higher up thought they were grant writers who designed the structure of the organization. So they thought as long as they throw tech at the problem, it would like magically be solved. But the person I was interviewing kept saying that they had to go back and actually use the data they had as a tool and not as a solution.
Yeah, that's great. I have a question for Bano and Lucy too, and I don't want to take all the time so that we can have some questions from Dean Mar. Anybody else wants to ask one? But let me ask the same question again a little better. I guess what I'm saying is data justice is a sort of research paradigm. There's a lot of different researchers who are looking in this area thinking, okay, data is important. There are ways that communities can use data to self-defined goods, self-defined goals, particularly social justice goals, so forms of equity. And so I guess I'm asking the group, did anybody come away feeling skeptical about that possibility? If we're being critical, did anybody end up critical of the whole kind of top level concept that data justice is like possible or doable? It seemed like all of you kind of landed on saying that it was contingent, that it depended on a lot of stuff, that it was maybe a kind of iffy or tentative proposition. I just wonder if anybody came away feeling skeptical that it was even possible.
To be honest, in a way, yes. I don't think like data justice alone will solve anything. I think it's like, it has to be based in community organizations. And it's just that data is a method that helps them. But data justice alone, yeah, I don't think that it could alone solve any problem.
Well, I wanted to add on to that. So firstly, back to your question about like what would be effective and good data. Like even as researchers, we know that like like what we have been talking about, we have to involve these community organizations with our research first of all, because if we don't, I mean, at best, we're going to be making like some assumptions, which really just doesn't lead to clear conclusions drawn. And also like interviewing the community organization allows us to ask them detailed questions that are just unable to be found otherwise. Like even like in my community organization, they understand that like when they're producing data outputs, they're still interviewing members of their community, and making sure that the tools that they output are matching the real needs of their stakeholders. As for your question about whether data justice can like actually bring change, I think that by itself, it really depends on the context, because for my organization, they believe that they were making a positive change in the world. Like they're saying, like they use data every day, and our goal is to make a difference in the world. And the data itself is obviously useless, but you have to use it in a way that mobilizes people and kind of is used as evidence to fight for change. Like, for example, they were talking about like how they're using their data to protect people who are unjustly prosecuted, or like there might be some criminal fabrication that goes that's like present, or like maybe there's like a destruction of evidence, or maybe they're forcing false testimony. So they're using this like data as support for other like social injustice movements. So by itself, it might not be as strong, but when you combine it with like social justice movements or actions or arguments, it can become very like powerful in pursuing data justice.
Similarly, I feel like when you look at environmental organizations, they also stress the fact that like the data is already present. The state already collects data to show that lower income communities are much more impacted by pollution than like other communities, yet like we are all aware of certain facts, and the data is already present even in non-environmental organizations, yet the data itself and like to pursue just environmental justice or just like that does nothing. Which is why my interviewee specifically, he was very focused on the fact that using it for policy and constantly it as a smaller part of his job, which I feel like is very telling of like the fact that data might be present and the want or like the push for advocacy might be there, but unless you are like very consistently pursuing these notions actively, like there's not much that just having data that shows your point does.
I have a question for Bono Lucy, but to our research associates, I don't know, you actually have made me feel less skeptical. I think I've gone through a few kind of waves of feeling like, oh yeah, data justice is possible, data justice is not possible. But actually today I feel more hopeful. I feel like narrow, tentative, provisional, risky, maybe, certainly not in every case, depending on a lot of other things, but definitely made me feel like, I guess, hopeful that could work. And so I wanted to ask, but my last question is for Bono and Lucy. And again, it's a top level question that we sort of started with. And I think all of the research associates have pointed out that they couldn't make sense of either the data they were looking at or the work that they were looking at without consultation with people in the community, particularly community organizers. And so I think the research associates also pointed out some of the problems in these kinds of relationships. So I was just wondering for Bono and Lucy, what do you think about, what kind of reflections do you have on working with community organizers, particularly for university researchers such as we?
I can start. So I think one key thing was that like IRB training is really crucial, but it also has a very specific view on what you are doing when you are anonymizing and protecting participants. Whereas people who are in these community organizations, they're also doing their own research. They're like coming up with their own ideas and they're analyzing the situations that they're in. And like actually enforcing anonymization is actually harmful. It is appropriating their work and their intellectual work, their thoughts, their creativity and their experiences for academic ends. And like in the name of protecting identity, you actually are taking credit for that and not giving credit for that kind of thought and analysis to the people in the organizations who are already doing that. Just because, like our undergraduates were saying, just because they don't have a degree, they're not in this program, doesn't mean that their thoughts don't count. They're just the anonymous participant one, and like you are the one who like found them. And so I think that kind of relationship we really need to work on disrupting that, especially in different kinds of research. Like obviously IRB comes out of medical, like violations in medical research. And there are a lot of cases where privacy is really, really important for people, your interlocutors, whoever you're talking to. But I think that like it's overused in the sense that a lot of these cases, like the default would be to just say like, well, I went into org X and I talked to person A and this is what I found that they said. And actually they should just have credit for what they said. And so I think that's like one big change in the relationship of social science researchers with community organizations that would be really helpful. But I mean, like it's a fraught relationship no matter what, but I think that it's important to try to improve it and not let the fact that like people may be frustrated with you, they may not trust you because of what happened before, mean that then, oh no, we can't talk to community organizers anymore. Like even like Manasi and I went to interview someone who was very frustrated with her past experiences with academics, but she still was super generous with us, giving us her time and sharing her ideas with us. And, you know, like she was very open about her past frustrations, but that didn't prevent her from trying to engage with us on like terms that she was more comfortable with.
Back to your comment, Roderick, just quickly, you said that like it was difficult for us researchers to understand these community organizations and their data without interviewing. I don't think that's exactly what we mean to say. I believe that like we had a pretty decent understanding of the organizations, but there's only so much that you can get from the website. So it's not so much that like we don't know anything or we can't understand the data that we receive. It's more that when you interview these organizations, you just like enter this whole different dimension of understanding, you know, because there's just so much that knowledge that they possess that they just really can't put on a website. And yeah. So.
Thank you.
I'll just quickly respond to Roderick's question. For me, I was particularly intrigued by just the politics of language and knowledge creation, because going through the interviews, the transcript that the undergrads did with the community organizers, I was trying to see if because the interview protocol was very specific in terms of like what questions to be asked and what not to be asked, like being very sensitive in terms of like not inputting ideas towards the interviewees. And I was trying to look for some sort of articulation of the notion of data justice, both literally the words data justice and also notions of data justice as we have tried to articulate it. And it's not necessarily there, is what I'm trying to say. Is that when we do this, as we move forward with our research and with our engagements with these community organizers, I think we need to be more sensitive about like this idea of in a very Star and Korean way of like listening forth to these organizations and seeing how they articulate or not articulate our preconceived ideas moving forward or as we engage them as well. And that's the beauty of this particular research, which you articulated in one form or another. One particular line you mentioned was like, we created uncertainty and we leaned into it. And it's a big part of that. I think a lot of some academics who engage with community organizers, they don't want to engage community organizers with uncertainty. They have this idea and framing of what they're going to look for or what they're going to seek. And it's a difficult dynamic because as the two of the respondents here, they themselves are very insecure about their identity as a data person for a community organizer, but they're very passionate about their role as community organizers that use data. So those kind of dynamics of knowledge creation and listening and politics of language, we need to take into consideration moving forward.
That's great, thank you. Do you want to ask any questions, Dean Moore? I already asked two.
I do. I have a couple. And first of all, again, just to echo some of the things that Professor Cook said, you know, this is just so great. And I do also come away very hopeful, especially after all the other things that have been going on and the role that, you know, data and movements around data justice is going to play in working to address anti-Black violence, you know, even on this very you know, we're not on campus, but you know what I mean when I say on campus, even on our very campus, the whole question of collecting data of incidents of police violence or other activities of the police with respect to our Black colleagues and students is something that needs to be addressed, and there isn't data, and we need to ask the question, why is there not the data, or why can't we get it? So this couldn't be more relevant. And also I just want to just put a little asterisk on how amazing it has been to watch a group of, students in ICS go through this journey and get to where you've come. It's just immensely gratifying for me. So thank you all for the work that you've done. I have a couple sort of concrete questions that I imagine ICS students can answer. As an anthropologist, I'd be like, here's a problem. You guys can build a thing to fix it. And so here's these two questions. I'm really sort of struck in Sion and Studi's work with their organizations by this question of what happens later, and sort of what's the afterlife of data. And for Sion, there's that kind of image that you had from your interviewee about, I don't know, the data's probably on a server somewhere, in an office, and what happens to it. And for Stuti, for these environmental organizations that rely on government data, right, that data might go away. There was a big effort after Trump got elected and before he was inaugurated on the part of a bunch of different data activist groups to download as much as possible off of government servers so that there were backup copies in case it all got deleted, and some of it had been, has been deleted and removed. If there is another Trump administration, there probably won't be an EPA or other organizations collecting this data. So that first question for the two of you, or anyone else who wants to chime in, is how can CS folks think about this question of sort of the afterlife of data or data preservation, or how can we ensure that an org that collects a lot of data, that data just doesn't end up on a server somewhere never to be used? How can it be preserved for use for the future, even if institutional structures like the organization or the government aren't there? That's the first one. I'll just put my second question out there too, which is, for all of you, what are some of the problems that the community organizations had or identified that were things that a CS student could actually help with, from their own specific technical expertise, right? What is it that you could bring to the table if you were to volunteer or be brought on board with one of these organizations?
So at least for the first question, I know that for environmental orgs, and specifically the community org that I was interviewing, he talked about well, actually all of them were talking about the fact that, especially in Southern California, there's a hierarchy of there's some organizations that are very on the ground and they survey people, and especially Wilmington and Torrance, and talk about air pollution and their health experiences. And then there's others that look at the actual data and can monitor and collect it. And then the one organization I was looking at, that one actually used that data from those orgs and from state to advocate. So this network of organizations, and just the collection and the sharing of data, that constant practice, I feel keeps a lot of the data alive or sustained, just in the network itself, because they're constantly using it, looking back, seeing how it can, those practices from collecting that data can be used in the future. So that practice, I feel at least can be used to preserve and actively use some of the data that is let's say for environmental, at least probably going to be behind closed doors, or for the state or for the government, or can be taken down from the EPA. But having those already living in the system and used for advocacy, and constantly recycling that, I feel keeps the data for at least environmental orgs alive.
Yeah, I guess kind of it's a tough question, because when I was there at the organization a few summers back, I noticed that they were super protective of their data, the data that they had. And part of that was probably because some of the data they had was somewhat personal information of the people that were helping out. So they didn't want to just give out the data to anyone. So I was there for about 3 months, and I got to see some of that data towards the end of the second month. So I'm not sure how they could put that data out for others to use, but partially their systems could have been more open sourced, so more people could have access to not their data, but at least the way they were using their data. But no, obviously none of their work was open source. It's sitting somewhere in their office right now. I guess that could be one way.
To answer the second question about how like what CS students can do, I think there's a few things as far as like specifically concerning my organization. They had to have workshops in order to teach people how to do technical things. So CS students could offer to help showcase these skills because they have a technical understanding of these things. Two, they could also help with website maintenance. The community organizers are really busy. They don't have time to like compile the infographics and also like put them online or even maintain the website. So that might be helpful just to like do some of the background work for that. And I think three, another thing students can do is pay attention to like what research groups they're in and what their peers are doing, and just like talk to people being like, okay, if someone's creating a predictive algorithm, maybe that's like not a good idea. Maybe the data you're using is not good. So just like having this communication within the community is also going to be really important in order to see some sort of real change.
Yeah, in terms of like data analysis and data processing, for example, like my organization, a lot of the data analysis that they did involved processing like custom scripts in Python, or like almost all of their data scripts are in Python. So that's an area that a CS student could actually help them with, and also just processing and storing this data securely, encrypting it, etc. And in terms of like my background, like I'm an informatics student, so and this organization actually works like heavily with a UX designer to kind of design their web tools and their interfaces to make them more accessible and usable to a user. So I mean, like UX or UI UX could also be really beneficial to these organizations, just like making their tools more accessible to the public and usable and readable. And you know, and that's also a really important important aspect of communicating this information to the community, because like some of these websites are really interactive and it's clear and easy to organize the information that you're viewing, and some of the websites you can tell like are pretty rudimentary and it's a little bit difficult to navigate. So that's another area that even CS students who aren't like helping in like that strict like CS sense can help out these organizations.
Great, thank you. You know, we should probably see if there's other folks here who have questions. And folks can just jump in, or is it set up so people can just unmute themselves and jump in, or do they have to raise their hands?
So Jenny will open the chat.
Just enable the chat if people want to type something in, or if they want to unmute themselves, they can raise their hands and ask a question.
Can have a few minutes to.
Oh, Melissa, you don't have a question?
Yeah, I'll keep it brief. This was so sophisticated and compelling that I wrote down a ton of questions, but I'll maybe leave them for the end if there's more time. I just wanted to quickly say on the question of can there be just data, to quote a maybe less played out Angela Davis quote, since she's on campus right now, freedom is a constant struggle. And I feel like your work really powerfully showed that. And I also, when Bill, you were talking about preservation, I couldn't help but think of Henrietta Lacks and HeLa cells, and how important narration is to preservation, narratives and storytelling. And so congratulations on collecting some really compelling ethnographic quotes, and just like great job. And if there's more time, I will ask questions.
Thanks, Melissa. We'll also provide our contact info of the entire team so we can continue this conversation. after this presentation, as we foresee ourselves along this path for quite some time.
Also, Lucy, I wanted to follow up with you too. I feel like we should stay in touch with the community organizers who have been, especially the community organizers who are real skeptical about working with academics and it's sort of been wronged already. I feel like we owe them, you know?
Yeah, for sure.
Also, when you guys said you were going to have a party after this is over, were you implying that I could only visit the party, or were you saying I could be invited?
You're invited.
Thank you.
Because you're taking care of the bill, right?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Well, give it a few seconds of silence and see if anyone wants to jump in with other questions. Otherwise, Melissa, feel free to go ahead with your question.
I have one question too, which is relates to the paper that we're working on now. And so I guess one read is that I think it was a great experience. I guess one read on it though is that always comes back in this REU business is scale. And so I guess I just wonder from our research associates, do you think that this could be done with more people, or do you think there's anything we learned about how to do this work that could be routinized or reused, or do you think every time we have to do it the way we did it, which is kind of like with ambiguity and then kind of feel and see how it goes?
I feel like, oh, go ahead.
I feel like it would depend on the students. Like if the students were already familiar or had like volunteer experience with organizations, I feel like then it's much easier to like quickly jump into like the concepts that we learned. But if they're very technical CS students, like most of us, and it's kind of like you have to, because even like the practice of like thinking of these ideas or like thinking of interview questions to like is very like ambiguous, and I feel like a lot of CS students do not have practice with that. So I think would depend on like the kind of students that are going to participate.
Yeah, I also think that if you are designing the RU with like an ambiguous nature in mind, then you probably would want to keep it around the same number as we had now, because like if it's like really ambiguous, like we often had like really like organic conversations that like everyone needs to have like a chance to speak. So if you have like way too many people in a meeting, everyone might not have a chance to like critically analyze things or like develop their own ideas. But then if you're doing like maybe an RU that's more focused on outreach to the community, I feel like it would only help to have more students to like potentially gather more interviews, because I think those are really invaluable in understanding them.
I can go ahead with my questions if that's cool.
Yeah.
So I guess, yeah, I had two kind of main questions. One thing that I was thinking a lot about as you were presenting was that there's a lot of kind of rich meta levels of analysis here, because you're studying data researchers while thinking about how you yourself are researchers collecting data. And so if anyone wanted to speak to how they think about their positionality as a data researcher now based on this experience, I would be really interested to hear that. And then the second question was, I was really interested in people talking about working with people who are skeptical of data, and especially because of what's happening right now, you know, like the way that legal observers or other people talk about both being neutral in their role that they're in, but also being affiliated to progressive organizations. And so my mind was just kind of thinking about how do you think about kind of the objectivity of what you're working with? And I guess there's this kind of liberal fiction that often is peddled in universities that there can be kind of neutral or objective data. So I'm just kind of curious to know if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, so as far as the second question goes, it kind of ties back into one of the trends that we saw in fall quarter about how data was sometimes used to like justify an organization's existence. So yeah, I don't really think that data is particularly objective because, you know, like you could use it in a way that justifies your position. So that was like one of the things that I realized, especially coming from a computer science background, where you're taught like, you know, tech is objective. Like if anything, no matter what's happening in the world, code is code or data is just numbers. But really, like I saw it play out in real time where this wasn't the case, where you could really use data to fit whatever narrative you're looking for. So it's really important to like critically analyze what you're looking at and trying to understand the results that come out of it.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like data in its like purest form maybe might be objective, but as soon as you tie it to an organization or a company or corporation and tie it to a narrative, it becomes like subjective, or it can just really deviate from objectivity. And what was your first question again? Sorry.
Just that you're data researchers thinking about data collection, like you're thinking about people collecting data while you yourself are collecting data. And how do you think of yourself as a data researcher? And if you do, like, why do you think about that role? Sorry, I know that's kind of like very meta.
I think for me at least, I didn't really realize what like the meta-ness of it until later on. I didn't realize that like the point of this RU was to learn ethics, and we were doing this by answering this question of how do community organizations use data to pursue justice. So like this whole time I was like focused on that question, and then by the end of it, you know, we came to this point, we were writing this paper, and that's when I realized like, wait, now I know about ethics. So I think it's really important for people with a computer science background, at least. Like this is I thought was a great approach to, you know, understand ethics through a real world example of answering a specific data or ethics related question, rather than just saying like ethics is important because X, Y, and Z.
That's also called graduate students being sneaky with the program design.
Well done, Bono and Lucy. But it's just awesome. It's awesome to hear this. You know, it's so fabulous.
Yeah, just thanks to everybody again. It was really great, like especially the research associates, my doctoral students, also Dean Bill and Jenny. Thanks so much. It was really great.
And we also want to recognize that both Dean Marios and our department chair, Andre, is here, or were here earlier as well. Thank you very much for joining us. As I mentioned, this REU was rooted in the datafication and community organizations workshop that Roderick and I organized, that was generously funded by Dean Marios. And again, with the support of Dean Bill and actually pushing through with this REU. So we're very excited to continue on with this particular, not only research agenda, but really commitment to our communities. And if there are no more last sentiments, we would like to thank everyone. And for the REU team, we would want you to stay because we need to have a screenshot to give NSF satisfied. So thanks again to everyone. And we hope that you continue to keep touch and look forward to outputs from our work and engage with us if you are so inclined as well. Thanks. Have a great weekend.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Congrats.
Thanks. REU team, let's just stay for one quick photo.
I'm going to stop recording. I'm going to stop recording.
Are you able to join for a second on